Under certain lights, the act of observing seems innocent, as if the observer were nothing more than a fixed point before the world. But what if that fixed point were only a well-trained mask? What if behind it there were an older, quieter force, shaping every gesture, every thought, before you even recognize them? We are not talking about some distant mystical character, but about the hidden presence that, invisible, writes its own story, using your life as its brush. The danger of believing only in the observer is accepting that you are passive before reality. That's the trick, because while your attention is caught on the surface, something deeper, the true creator, operates behind the scenes, deciding what is seen and what is erased. Realizing this is not an intellectual exercise, it is a radical shift at the center of who you think you are. Today, if you stay with me until the end of this video, you will not only understand that the observer is a mask, you will feel the impact of removing that mask within yourself. You will discover how to identify the creator hiding behind it and learn to speak its language. Staying until the end means allowing a new territory to be revealed inside you, a territory where perception and creation are not separate, and where the role of spectator dissolves. This is the promise. By the end, you will no longer be standing before your life as someone watching from the outside. You will be seated in the place of the one who decides the next scene. The observer, no matter how serene it seems, is not a neutral state. It is a construction, a character that has learned to look at the world by filtering, cropping, and above all, editing what reaches your consciousness. It is like a lens that not only records but decides what will be remembered and what will be lost. This selectivity is not accidental. It has been shaped by years of conditioning, internal narratives, and external influences that define what you believe to be real. On the surface, it may seem that the observer is pure consciousness itself, but if we look more closely, we realize that it carries preferences, judgments, expectations. It does not merely see, it interprets. And this interpretation is the exact point where reality begins to warp. What we call the eye that observes is, in fact, an entity molded by accumulated experiences, inherited traits, and stories you repeat without noticing. Neuroscientifically, this phenomenon is supported by the functioning of the brain's predictive networks. Before any stimulus reaches your conscious perception, the nervous system is already anticipating, comparing, and fitting what it sees into known patterns. This means that much of your experience is not the result of what is happening now, but of what the brain expects to happen. The observer, in this context, is the narrator of these predictions, not the real creator of events. There is also a spiritual dimension to this understanding. Many ancient traditions speak of a witnessing consciousness, something untouched by thoughts or emotions. But this witness that many take as the final point of self-knowledge may still be nothing more than the masked observer. A sophisticated role, yet still a role, part of the theater, not the whole stage. That is why so many people reach a point of apparent clarity and still feel that something is missing. The true creator operates on a deeper level, where perception and manifestation are inseparable. At this level, there is no gap between seeing and creating. The act of perceiving is already a creative choice, even if unconscious. But to reach this territory, it is necessary to realize that the observer is not an impartial master, but an interpreter with a limited repertoire. It protects you from certain experiences, but at the same time prevents you from accessing others. Think of the observer as a gatekeeper. It keeps the castle doors closed to anything that seems threatening, strange, or outside what your personal history has deemed safe. But what it calls safety is often nothing more than repetition of the known, and what it calls danger may, in fact, be the entrance to new forms of life. By believing blindly in the observer, you keep yourself confined to the inner courtyard, while the true creator waits outside, before horizons you do not know exist. Quantum physics also offers a powerful metaphor for this dilemma. At the particle level, the act of observing directly influences the outcome, but not just any observation. It is the intention embedded in the process that determines the collapse of possibilities. This shows us that the observer alone does not hold the real power. It merely channels or blocks the creative flow according to learned parameters. The creator behind it is the one who decides which intention will be applied. By understanding this difference, one begins to realize that life is not just something that happens before your eyes. The stage is not fixed, and the plot is not an unchangeable script. What we see is, to a large extent, a version edited by the mask we call the observer. Removing this mask, even for moments, reveals a presence that is not merely watching. It is shaping, combining, reorganizing the very structure of what you call reality. That is why the first step is not to destroy the observer, but to recognize it, to understand that it is a filter, not the source. By naming this role and seeing it in action, you begin to notice the creator working behind the scenes. This recognition makes room for perception to stop being a conditioned reflex and become a conscious act of creation. And that is when life stops being something observed from a distance and becomes a work in constant motion. Recognizing the observer as a filter is like realizing that the landscape you see through the window is not the real landscape, but a painting made by someone who carefully chose which elements to show and which to hide. This someone is shaped by your history, beliefs, and experiences, and is constantly rearranging the scene before you perceive it. But the true creator, the one who not only edits but builds the horizon itself, acts before the image even reaches the frame. The problem is that the observer presents itself with a silent authority, as if it were awakened consciousness itself. It disguises itself as clarity, as impartiality, and that is exactly why its presence is so hard to detect. It does not lie outright. It selects truths, and this selection, made without your direct awareness, keeps you trapped in a reduced version of what you could experience. Neuroscience shows us that the brain filters billions of pieces of information every second and allows only a fraction to pass into consciousness. These choices are not made randomly. They follow patterns reinforced over an entire lifetime. The observer, in this sense, is like the narrator of these choices, but the one who dictates the rules for this narrator is the creator behind it, shaping expectations and calibrating perception to sustain a certain version of reality. In the realm of spirituality, this dynamic is described differently. Many teachers speak of pure witnessing, but also warn that this purity can be illusory. It is possible to believe you are seeing clearly when in fact you are only looking through a highly sophisticated filter. The illusion is not just believing in external appearances, but also believing that the consciousness which observes is already the final truth. This is the point where many stop and think they have arrived, when in reality they are standing before a door they have not yet opened. Quantum physics brings a powerful analogy here. When observing subatomic particles, it becomes clear that the result depends on the interaction between the act of observing and the system's initial state. This means that it is not the isolated act of looking that creates the result, but the entire set of intentions, expectations, and energetic patterns involved. The observer alone does not hold the power. It acts as a channel, and it is the creator behind it that determines which of the infinite possibilities will become visible. This creator is not a distant or mystical figure. It is the silent core that decides what is possible for you. It does not merely react to what happens, it sets the conditions for certain experiences to occur. But to access this core, it is necessary to realize that the observer is only an interface, an intermediate layer. This realization is uncomfortable at first because it dismantles the sense of control the observer offers. Yet it is precisely this dismantling that clears the way for something greater. The interesting thing is that as you begin to notice the observer's choices, you discover that your life contains far more invisible decisions than you imagined. Situations that seem inevitable are often just repetitions of patterns the creator has chosen to maintain through the observer's filter. It is like watching a movie where the scenes repeat, but believing everything is happening for the first time. By questioning the filter, you begin to notice the repeated scenes, and more importantly, the possibility of changing them. This shift in perspective requires practice and attention. It is not about eliminating the observer, but repositioning it. It can cease to be an unconscious editor and become a collaborator with the creator. This means looking at reality not just to record it, but to realize that every observation is also a creative statement. It is the difference between watching a river flow and deciding to change its course with a simple gesture. Throughout this journey, a new clarity begins to take root. The clarity that everything you see is, in some way, a reflection of the invisible choices your inner creator has made. And each time you identify the observer's filter, you take a step toward this creative center. It is a gradual process, but inevitably transformative, because it reveals that the world before you is less a fixed given and more a work in constant rewriting. Upon realizing that the observer is merely an interface, a second impact emerges. It is not only partial but also adaptable. This means that as you begin to question it, it adjusts, changes tone, alters the narratives it repeats. It can even pretend to be waking up along with you, just to keep its central role intact. It is a sophisticated self-preservation mechanism, like a character rewriting its script to avoid leaving the stage. This inner game reveals something profound. The true creator does not operate under the logic of control, but under the logic of possibility. While the observer wants to stabilize the narrative to ensure safety, the creator prefers to keep the field open so that the new can emerge. This difference is fundamental, because it shows that the function of the observer is to maintain coherence, while the function of the creator is to provoke transformation. In practice, this manifests in the way we react to events. Faced with a challenge, the observer tends to search for references in the past, trying to fit the situation into something already known. It interprets everything in light of what has already been experienced, which limits the creative response. The creator, on the other hand, is not bound to references. It acts as one standing before a fertile field where any seed can generate an entirely new reality. This difference between interpretation and creation is what separates a life guided by repetition from a life guided by conscious manifestation. This understanding also finds resonance in quantum physics, especially in the idea that the observer influences the outcome not merely by recording, but by the quality of its interaction with the system. It is as if the human observer were a domesticated version of this principle, influencing, yes, but within a narrow range of possibilities, limited by what it deems acceptable. The creator does not recognize these boundaries. It works in the territory of all possibilities, including those the observer automatically discards. Here lies a subtlety. Many spiritual practices teach to observe without judging, believing that this connects us to the core of consciousness. This posture can be valuable, but it is not the final point. Observing without judging is still observing, and if the goal is to reach the creator, it is necessary to go beyond observation and enter the act of shaping. Not shaping from superficial desires or the fear of losing something, but shaping from a state of presence that recognizes its own capacity to alter the form of experience. This transition is not a sudden leap. It begins with small cracks in the observer's absolute power. You notice it hesitates, that it does not always know what to do when faced with something completely new, and in those moments of hesitation, the creator can act directly. It is as if, through a small gap, the original light enters and reveals that the entire scene is being built in real time. Once you see this construction happening, you can no longer fully believe in the observer's fixed role. The curious thing is that, by weakening the observer's dominance, clarity is not lost. On the contrary, perception expands because it now includes territories that were previously censored. This may produce a strange feeling at first, as if reality were more alive or more unstable. But this instability is not insecurity. It is the creative field in motion. It is the creator breathing through the structures and reminding you that everything can change. In this process, it becomes evident that the observer is not an enemy, but neither is it the absolute master. It is a tool, and like any tool, it only makes sense when used consciously. By repositioning the observer, the creator can finally operate without blockages, turning perception into a creative gesture. And it is in this fusion that life ceases to be a fixed stage and becomes a continuous flow of reinvention. Recognizing this radically changes how we relate to what happens. It is no longer about waiting to see or analyzing before acting. It is about assuming that every look, every interpretation, and every choice are in fact seeds cast into the field of possibilities, and that the creator, unlike the observer, does not fear the new, it calls it forth. With the domain of the creator beginning to reveal itself, the role of the observer starts to be questioned more deeply. It ceases to be seen as consciousness itself and begins to appear as a kind of conditioned narrator, one that insists on interpreting facts from a familiar logic. This recognition is decisive because it reveals that much of our experience does not come from what is happening, but from what the observer chooses to highlight. This selection is not neutral. It is guided by accumulated memories, fears, and preferences. The observer is efficient at keeping the narrative cohesive, but pays the price of sacrificing possibilities that do not fit the plot. The creator, in turn, has no commitment to linearity. It does not seek coherence at all costs, but potency. It feeds on the unexpected and sees value in events that to the observer may seem meaningless or even threatening. Neuroscience describes something similar in the functioning of attention. By focusing on certain stimuli and ignoring others, we create a very specific cut of reality. The observer is the agent of this selective focus, but the creator is the one who decides at the deepest level what the general inclination of this focus will be. And it is precisely in this subterranean layer that the opportunities for real change lie, because it is there that perception ceases to be passive and begins to actively participate in creating the scene. In the spiritual field, this relationship manifests as the difference between contemplating and co-creating. Many traditions speak about awakening as the ability to see clearly, but few go deeper into the next step, using that clarity to alter the very field of experience. The observer can keep the mind attentive and lucid, but the creator is the one who plants new possibilities in the soil of that lucidity. Quantum physics, once again, offers a symbolic image for this idea. The collapse of the wave function does not occur merely through the act of observing, but through the type of interaction established between the observer and the system. This means that it is not enough to look. It is necessary to infuse the gaze with creative intention so that reality shapes itself according to new frequencies. The observer, alone, can only record what already exists. The creator, acting behind it, alters what exists before it is even recorded. This perception opens space for specific internal practices. Instead of merely noticing thoughts and sensations, it is possible to intervene in the quality of attention. This means that, faced with a situation, you can deliberately sustain an internal disposition that favors a different outcome. It is not about forcing the mind to believe in something unreal, but about adjusting the internal field in such a way that new responses become natural. The creator acts exactly like this. It does not force the world, it changes the starting point. Over time, this process becomes more spontaneous. The observer, once repositioned, begins to collaborate. It stops resisting the new and starts to register evidence that supports the creations of the inner core. What was once filtered through fear or inertia begins to be perceived as opportunity. It is as if the narrator learned a new, broader language, capable of telling stories that once seemed impossible. This change does not mean the observer disappears, but that it loses the pretense of being the protagonist. And this is liberating, because while the observer tries to preserve what already exists, the creator seeks to expand. When both work in harmony, perception becomes a tool for conscious manifestation, and not merely a record of what is already given. At this point, life ceases to seem like an inevitable sequence of events and begins to present itself as a living, mutable field, sensitive to internal choices. The observer's role becomes that of a collaborative witness, while the creator holds the invisible reins of form and flow. And it is in this silent dialogue that the greatest transformations begin to happen, not as sudden ruptures, but as a natural alignment between what is seen and what is decided to be created. Upon realizing this possible harmony between creator and observer, the opportunity arises to turn this relationship into a conscious practice. The key lies in shifting the center of command, allowing the creator to set the direction while the observer records, amplifies, and refines the process. This inversion is more than a mental reorganization. It is a change in how reality is experienced, as it alters the origin point of choices. The first step is to train perception to identify the exact moment when the observer tries to take the lead. This can happen subtly through automatic judgments, quick conclusions, or emotional reactions that present themselves as absolute evidence. When detecting this movement, there is no need to confront it forcefully. Simply shift your attention to the space before any interpretation, that point where the experience has not yet been narrated. In that space, the creator manifests clearly. Contemplative practices can help, but with an important nuance. The goal is not merely to calm the mind, but to sustain a state in which perception and creation happen simultaneously. The observer observes, but under the direct influence of the creator. This fusion requires presence and intention, for even the smallest deviation allows the conditioned narrator to retake control. Neuroscience suggests that lasting changes in perception require repetition and consistency. This means that a single moment of clarity is not enough. It is necessary to create a new pattern in which the creator is the source of internal decisions. Each time you identify the observer's attempt to limit the field and choose to expand it, you reinforce this new mental architecture. Over time, the observer itself begins to operate based on these broader parameters, transforming into an ally. From a spiritual perspective, this practice is similar to taking on the role of co-author of the storyline you live. It is not about controlling every external event, but about influencing the internal matrix from which these events emerge. It is about working on the subtle plane where intentions, vibrations, and meanings have not yet solidified into concrete events. Here, the observer acts as the guardian of attention, but the creator decides where that attention will be directed. Quantum physics once again offers an intriguing parallel. Quantum systems are not defined until they interact with an observer, but the nature of this interaction, the parameters and the initial configuration, is what determines the outcome. Translated into human experience, the creator is the one who sets up the experiment before the observer records it. This setup includes not only expectations, but also emotional states and internal dispositions that together shape the final form of perceived reality. Applying this in daily life, one notices that small internal changes generate significant repercussions. A shift in intention, for example, can completely alter the way an event is interpreted. The observer, in recording the experience, already perceives it under this new lens, reinforcing the creative cycle. It is like changing the tone of a light before turning it on. Everything that appears will be colored by this new frequency. This ongoing practice also reveals that it is not necessary to eliminate the observer to access the creator. On the contrary, it is the integration of the two that gives stability to conscious creation. Without the attentive recording of the observer, the inner core's creations would be lost in the chaotic flow of stimuli. Without the creator's guidance, the observer would remain stuck in old narratives. It is in balanced interdependence that maximum potential is found. Over time, this way of living generates a sense of expanded authorship. Life ceases to seem like a set of disconnected facts and begins to reveal itself as a coherent field where each internal choice has weight and consequence. The observer becomes more sensitive to subtleties, while the creator strengthens as a source of direction. And in this partnership, the role of spectator gives way to that of active participant, not by imposition, but by nature. This is the essence of the transition, moving from a state in which reality is filtered and commented on to a state in which it is shaped in the very act of being perceived. The observer does not disappear but is repositioned. The creator does not come out of nowhere, it is recognized. And life under this new dynamic becomes less of a spectacle and more of a living dialogue between the one who sees and the one who creates. At the point where creator and observer begin to act in unison, something subtle yet definitive happens. The feeling of being separate from your own life dissolves. You no longer see yourself as someone who merely records or interprets what arises, but as an active part of the very fabric of events. The observer is still there, but now like a craftsman working alongside the invisible architect who has always been in charge. This union is not a fixed state, it is a flow. On some days, the inner narrator may try to retake control, and that's fine. Each return to the creative perspective strengthens the ability to keep it alive. The essential thing is to remember that every experience is an open field, and that the way it manifests depends not only on the gaze, but on the origin of that gaze. When the creator sustains the direction, the observer becomes an amplifier, and the world responds with a richness that once seemed inaccessible. In the end, understanding that the observer is just a mask, and that the true creator hides behind it, is more than a conceptual revelation. It is a shift in posture toward life. It is recognizing that each perception carries an implicit decision about which reality you are feeding, and that by changing this decision, the entire scene can rearrange itself. If you've made it this far, write in the comments, "I am more than the observer," so I know this message resonated with you. And if this content made sense, subscribe to the channel to receive more videos that deepen this journey between seeing and creating.